Good afternoon. This is the National Association for Regulatory Utility Commissioners Center for Partnerships and Innovation Performance-Based Regulation Working Group meeting on multi-year rate plans. Today is June 3rd, 2020. This is me. I'm Carrie Worthington. I'm with the NARUC staff if you have any questions. Today we have three expert speakers to share their experiences on multi-year rate plans. First up is former Commissioner David Littell. He was a commissioner at Maine, and he is currently a senior regulatory advisor at the Regulatory Assistance Project and an attorney at Bernstein Shore. I met David back in 2012, and we are very lucky to have him on this call today because he is an expert on the topic itself, written with being an author on a variety of papers on the topic, and his regulatory experience being a commissioner is a gift today. So we also have two all-star staff members, one from the Georgia Public Service Commission, Jamie Barber. Jamie is the chair of the staff subcommittee on rate design, and I've been working with her since at least 2015. So I'm very excited to have her as well. Georgia is a pretty unique state, so we're lucky to have their perspective. Similarly, Washington is also more of a vertically integrated state, but Washington will also share their experience with their staffer, Amy Andrews, who has a math background. She was a math teacher before she joined the commission about a decade ago. So really appreciate that analytical, deeper thinking that she has. So welcome speakers and welcome performance-based regulation working group members. At the end, we'll be able to have a Q&A and discussion that's necessary. Commissioner Littell, former Commissioner Littell, the floor is yours.
Okay. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. Well, good to be with you all this afternoon. I see that there are a number of folks who we've worked with at the Regulatory Assistance Project on the call. I know there are a bunch of ringers on, so I'll put that right up front. If you want to ask me a question that will stump me, I'll bet you'll be able to do it looking at the number of experts on the call. The presentation that's structured today, you can go to the next slide, Carrie, has a section 1, which is performance-based rulemaking basics. And I didn't intend to cover that with a level of expertise, and this is a PBR staff group, but I'm happy to answer questions on it. That contains our basic approach that we've outlined in a series of 3 volumes that we published with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and their Clean Energy Ministries, which is our international program that's referred to at the links at the end of it. So I think you'd all get that. I'll pause to see if there are any questions on that as I go over the rest of the overview. The second section I'll spend a little bit of time on is I thought it would be helpful just to look at the basic sort of formulas for how we approach revenue requirements and rates, and look at how various different forms of performance regulation affect different parts of that, just to keep that in mind, because when you get down to brass tacks to actually do this type of thing in a rate case or other proceeding, a separate proceeding if you have that, you need to deal with those issues, and the overlap can become a real concern and focus. I've seen that working with some of you. And then I'm going to spend the bulk of time on the third section of the presentation, which is PBR for efficiency, which are multi-year rate plans, which have a much longer history than some other forms of more recent PBR that we've been looking at with some of you. So with that, if there are no questions on section 1, then we can go directly to section 2. And I'll give you time to get there. Now, we're starting section 2. Which is the basic mechanics of how we set a revenue requirement. Yep, and that's fine to go to that slide. This slide shows the basic requirements for how we do it, right? Which is rate cases come in. If any of you are new commissioners and haven't sat on a rate case before, you have this to look forward to. You have a lot of filings just to establish what the actual costs of the utility are in the particular test year. So those would establish your O&M costs as part of the expense items. If you're vertically integrated, your fuel purchase, and even if you're not, you might have purchase power cost under that expense item, and depreciation and or amortization expense also get counted there. And then you add to that your return that's allowed multiplied by the rate base. That's the CapEx part of the determination, and a lot of work that goes into that, both of those elements. And then on top of that, the income taxes and other taxes are added in. Usually those are given items, and you end up with a revenue requirement, and that's your revenue requirement in test year. So next slide. That's then used to establish your rates. And your rates across different classes would be how much you pay on a volumetric basis per kilowatt hour, how much you pay for capacity for the commercial and industrial rates, and a customer charge that's typically different for each rate class. And the reason this slide is entitled "The Historic Way Utilities Did Well" is that for those that are still in growth parts of the country, at least pre-pandemic growth parts of the country, you still may be in a situation where sales and peak are growing year after year. But traditionally, when that happened, utilities could have their rates established and then make money in between rate cases, so they didn't necessarily have to come in immediately again for it by growth in sales, even at a set rate, growth in demand, which would also increase revenues, and their customer growth. All three of those tended to increase utility revenues, so would allow utilities to stay out. In jurisdictions where we don't have a lot of load growth, that has sort of gone away, leading to more pressure and discussions around what people call the utility business model. Next slide. So that's what we do now. Now, I start with a real basic. Some of the vertically integrated utilities had allowed for fuel adjustment clauses or purchase power adjustments, and that was an acknowledgement that, like, when some utilities came in and fuel prices were very volatile, saying, look, you can't control those, we'll allow you to pass those through to customers. And so that operated then as an adjustment in the test year revenue requirement. And it seems reasonable, except as some of you, some commissions, particularly Hawaii comes to mind, realize it provides a disincentive to actually manage purchase power fuel costs, and if there's some units that are less efficient than others, but the utility wants to continue to run for a variety of reasons, they don't have an incentive to manage that. So it does create a perverse incentive in doing that, and that's sort of simple, but it's important to keep that in mind when you're talking about any type of rider, not just a fuel adjustment clause. Next slide. And then we get a little bit more complicated. So now multi-year rate plans. And this is the most expansive for vertically integrated utilities, typically have attrition adjustment mechanisms, sometimes called ARMs. And those would typically have, and we'll go into detail on this, an inflation factor minus a productivity factor, or you could have some type of stair-step increase or a tracker or a hybrid. And those are added to the revenue requirement. So you have an ARM adjustment periodically, and those can affect any of the rates as specified in that mechanism. So we'll go into detail on that, but that's where they come in. Next slide shows if you have a performance incentive, which most, I would gather to say, most utilities do have some form of performance incentive, but they don't think of it as such. They might for energy efficiency programs, they might for renewables, they might for different types of performance. And that typically gets added to the revenue requirement. So it comes in sort of a similar place, but through a different way to make an annual adjustment to that, or less than annual if that's the way the commission has it set up. And that would flow directly through to rates that would be adjusted annually. Next slide. And lastly, you've got revenue decoupling. Now, revenue decoupling obviously tends to be designed to keep the target revenue the same, and it varies rates, so that you'd have target revenue with this arrow going over to collected revenue that would be the same. So you'd have a variety of mechanisms, and those mechanisms, just like multi-year rate plans, can be designed in a lot of different ways. The detail is extremely important on them, which is why we'll go through it here. So that's the basic math. Next slide. And now we're going to go through what a multi-year rate plan does. Now, why would jurisdictions consider a multi-year rate plan? One reason is it generally can align, if it's done right, the interests of the utilities, regulators, and customers in general. Cost of service regulation doesn't do that. You've got a very strong CapEx bias. You've got a very strong throughput incentive, and some of the other issues with traditional cost of service rulemaking that we noted. It can also reduce the frequency of rate cases. Some commissions are very interested in that. They're constantly on what I call the gerbil wheel, which is what it felt to me like when I was a commissioner. You finish 1 week, you go to the next week, bigger cases you have to read. You're just constantly managing things coming at you and don't have enough time to think proactively. It can improve the culture of utility management, get them out of the mindset of, hey, we're going to go back to the commission to increase our revenue and make them think about actually operating more efficiently to increase their revenue or decrease their costs and therefore increase their shareholder payments. It can also improve utility performance and lower costs. There's a lot of evidence that that's the case, particularly from the work that Mark Lowry has done reviewing these. And it can strengthen the incentives for utilities to improve their performance and or allow them time for large initiatives to yield results. So those are the primary reasons why you'd see a commission consider it. Sometimes they call them alternative forms of regulation, sometimes multi-year rate plans, but pretty similar things. Next slide. Now, this slide illustrates one sort of basic thing, and some of you are familiar with this example. A telecom called Pacific Northwest Bell was allowed to keep any savings in the 1980s that they recovered. And what that resulted in was they cut costs quite significantly. They cut customer service. They actually charged customers for calling into their phone line. It was an old 900 lines where customers were charged for every minute they were on, and they kept them on for a long time. Great incentive for the utility to keep them on for a long time. Pretty bad design. Customers were not happy. That illustrates a basic lesson that some people say a utility would never do that. Well, this utility did that. It was terminated, but it illustrates that in any multi-year rate plan, you really need to define customer service and reliability metrics to make sure that you're getting the expected level of either increase or holding those steady, so you don't create a perverse incentive to cut back on the expense side if you do that. So that's a given. Next slide. And the next slide illustrates Maine's experience. This is taken from a series of studies done by Mark Lowry, who's with a consulting group and does a lot of work for states, commissions, and public advocates. He's assessed the productivity of multiple utilities across the sector, and in particular, he often uses central Maine power from my jurisdiction of Maine to illustrate that over a long time period operating on a series of 3 different multi-year rate plans, the productivity of central Maine power actually did go up a good bit, right? This was a fairly stable period where expenses were known, operations were known. So that's a good story of how it can enhance utility productivity. The particular Maine plan allowed the utility to keep 100% of the savings, creating a strong incentive. Mark's research suggests that's more effective. Common sense suggests that would be more effective too. Okay, so let's dive into the details. Next slide. So the basics of a multi-year rate plan is typically you get a rate and then it's meant to stay in place for 3 to 5 years. We already talked about an ARM. You can also build in other cost containment mechanisms, and you can have some types of earning sharings or profit sharing mechanisms built in. You can have performance incentives built into it as well, such as, for instance, increasing reliability. And it often has to be and should be well designed to work with other mechanisms that may be in place, such as decoupling, because you'll have similar formulas and adjustment mechanisms working under each. You want to make sure they work together in the way that the commission anticipates and don't have unintended impacts. Next slide. Now, 4 different basic approaches to ARMs, which can be mixed. One is to make an adjustment factor, and here we're really talking about what you call the Kfactor, which is the cost factor in any formula. You can have a rate adjustment based on basic predictions of the consumer price index is one basics. Another would be the Handy Whitman Construction Index, or some modified utility cost increase mechanism based on forecasts of what costs could be. You can also index those based on what they come out to be in any one year. And you can have a hybrid of them. So one thing we've seen a lot of in the U.S. is that operational expenses might be indexed to a particular cost measure, but if there's an expectation of what the capital expenses will be based on the rate case that you, because these plans are all built on basic rate cases, right? I mean, any form of performance-based regulation isn't an alternative, even if it's called an alternative form of regulation. They're all built on the basics of doing a rate case and knowing how to do that well. So you build it on your CapEx, and you could have a hybrid version. Or you could simply have a rate freeze, which is, again, Maine's very simple version. We had a rate freeze, and we let the utility within those rates keep the money until they came back in. One problem that has is it can exacerbate the tendency of utilities to want to sell more, right? Because so they could become adverse to energy efficiency and other demand side management measures if you have a rate freeze in effect, because it would certainly reduce their revenue. Next slide. So that's that sort of Kfactor adjustments. And you can see how I've already described the inflation one on the left, which would be a typical adjustment type of factor. You can also have other factors, and these are very important. A productivity factor is, okay, well, you know, and these are all, frankly, worked out with the utilities, right? Because as I point out, it's very hard to force a utility to do one of these if they don't want to. And so the utility comes in and says they want to do this, and because it'll be more productive, and you say, okay, more productive, let's talk about that. Give us your expert testimony on that. And they calculate how much more productive they should be using some productivity factor like Mark Lowry's, and you build that into the formula. So we expect you to be 0.75%, 750 basis points more productive each year, for instance, and you build that right in. That's an expectation. One of the primary reasons you do this, right? I'll come back to that in a second. There's also other factors like things you can't control. Do you want to adjust for changes in the economy, just like decoupling, or other factors such as, say, tax cuts or tax increases that could have a big factor? So that's called the Z factor, the exogenous adjustments. And then there's the stretch factor, which could be, okay, and we want you to do better based on what you've been able to do in the past. We always had a stretch factor in Maine in addition to the productivity factor, and it worked out. The committee hit those numbers. You have to have a good enough sense that they're not hitting them by cutting in the wrong place, but they did. It worked out fairly well. So I just want to come back to productivity factor for a second, because we've seen a trend that, well, I won't miss any words, I find disturbing, from the utility sector. And it started, at least my first experience with it was when I was on the Maine Commission, when Central Maine Power came in and asked for a form of multi-year rate plan, but it had so many asks in it that the commission that I was on turned it down, including, you know, some commissioners that were pretty favorable to the utility, but found it a little bit too much to ask for. So what it did, one of those things that was quite a bit, was asking for a negative productivity factor. They produced some testimony. You'll see it from a lot of utility experts saying the utility industry is actually becoming a negative productivity factor industry, meaning that it's less productive than zero. But they turned around and said, well, you should allow us to multiply by a negative productivity factor, which means you're actually going to give us an incentive for being unproductive, right? That just didn't seem right to us. Up until some Massachusetts decisions, I hadn't been aware of any utilities that had done that. Massachusetts has recently given negative productivity factors, but it is what it is, I guess. We can talk more about it if you want to. So we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, cost trackers can expedite certain costs, in particular in jurisdictions that we've dealt with that really want to do multi-year rate plans, but have an expectation that they have to put a lot of capital expenditure into upgrading their systems, or may have separate grid modernization initiatives. There may be some desire to deal with those as part of a rider. Oops, something happened. We'll get back there. Yes. Oh, okay. So you can add riders. They should be done very cautiously with a multi-year rate plan, because any costs that are taken out of the basic formula really mute the basic reason why you're doing a multi-year rate plan, which is to create an incentive for efficient utility operations, and to keep your eye on the ball. So that's sort of an important caveat, but there are legitimate reasons to look at it and consider it. If there are a majority of the costs, you might want to question whether you really want to do a multi-year rate plan in that case or not. So more detail on that if you want to talk about that after. Next slide. Until we, oh, wrong direction. Yeah, and this is earn and sharing mechanisms are often built in, not just to multi-year rate plans, but to other forms of performance incentives. In the context of multi-year rate plans, at least the research that we've looked at shows that 11 states have them. They typically can be asymmetric, so that you would have some sharing that kicks in after what you call a deadband. So you might give 25 basis points on either side, and then on one side, the downside, ratepayers don't share in the loss. That's pretty typical. That's what's meant by asymmetric. But on the high side, at 25 basis points or more, then you'd start to share the savings with ratepayers, meaning the utilities would get to keep some of it, but not all of it. They'd have to pass through something in an accounting mechanism to ratepayers. Fairly typical. I think there's a regulatory instinct of us to want to share these revenues with ratepayers, but they do obviously mute the incentive of the utility to achieve efficiencies, and that's the result of some of Mark Lowry's outside work. Okay, next slide. I think this is the last of the substantive slides. Yes, it is. Okay, and this is like the rock face before you get to the top of the mountain, right? Very busy slide. I'll try to keep it simple. If you have a rate plan that says it goes 5 years, and there's no guarantee that the utility will get to keep savings achieved in years 4 and 5, that creates a big incentive to make cuts in CapEx and OpEx up front in years 1 and 2 to ensure that during their 5 years, for instance, they get the savings. Efficiency carryover mechanisms are mechanisms that are designed to allow utilities to carry between different rate plans those savings forward, so that it doesn't create that perverse incentive. And that perverse incentive usually comes as a result of the details that you look at in a rate case, but they can be important to ensuring that you have consistent operations and consistent incentives to operate efficiently. So why don't we go from the concluding slide to the resources slide. I'll just conclude on 2 points. One is, this is a resource slide. The first 3 volumes are from a large study of performance-based regulation writ large that Regulatory Assistance Project did with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, their Clean Energy Ministry, which is their international program. And the last 3 are very specific PBR pieces that we did working with one particular state. We have a number of others. These are generic in their presentation, but show how you can use PBR for particular things, including, for instance, to try to control the distribution system costs, or get a handle on them anyway. So those are some important resources. And I just note my Twitter, for those that are on Twitter or considering being on Twitter, there is a refined energy Twitter group of experts that has discussions. And even within the last week, I've gone back and forth with some people like Chris Villarreal, who some of you may know, the former electricity director in Minnesota, who isn't so keen on performance-based rulemaking. So we've got, but I've used him to peer review some of these papers that you see here. It's good to get peer reviewed by someone who is skeptical of what you can do. So very active discussion there for any of you that are interested in kind of energy geeking out on that stuff, and looking for resources if you're interested. So with that, look forward to the discussion from you and to the comments that we'll get from Amy and Jamie.
Thank you. Thanks so much, former Commissioner. Next up, we have Jamie Barber from Georgia Commission staff. Jamie?
There we go. Thanks, Carrie. Next slide, please. Okay, as Dave has just said, multi-year rate plans have been around in Georgia for a long time, since 1991. If you were to come to the commission and ask anyone, do you have a multi-year rate plan, you would probably get some looks, because around the commission, it's known as the alternate rate plan or earnings sharing. We really don't use the terminology multi-year rate plan. Multi-year rate plans have been filed. Normally it's every 3 years, but you'll see some gaps, and I'm really going to focus on the last 10 years, but back in 2016, the Georgia Power rate case was delayed as part of the merger settlement between Southern Company and AGL Resources. So basically, Georgia Power was not in for a rate case from 2013 until 2019, which was last year, which you'll see some changes which were made to their earnings sharing band. The earnings dead band was established in 1998, and at that time, and you'll see from 2001 until last year, the excess earnings were refunded to customers 2/3, and the company retained 1/3. Those percentages were changed as part of the last year's settlement and commission order, which I'll discuss more in detail later in the presentation. As part of the compliance for us tracking the company's compliance with the multi-year rate plan, the company has to file an annual surveillance report by March 15th of each year. And generally, the commission staff takes about a year to do its review of compliance with the rate case order, and then staff would issue its report to the commission for its consideration. Next slide, Carrie. Okay, this is just an example I put together the last 9 years for you to look at to kind of see what the company's filed return on equity was and what staff adjusted ROE was. And to the left, you can kind of see some of the excluded expenses that we adjusted to the company's reported earnings. A lot of these probably look very familiar to you, but these were things that were excluded from the company's filing that would adjust the ROE. 2018, you probably look to see 2018 and 2019, there's pretty significant excess earnings. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to the fact in 2016, the company was not in for a rate case. They did merge, and there was some synergies, and the company's rates were not adjusted. So we attribute a lot of that to that happening. The 2018 has been resolved, and the 2019 is pending, and I will discuss that more later in the presentation. Next slide. Okay, this was the ASR result. It was filed by the company last March. The commission just recently approved it March 20th. There was X earnings of over $154 million. The customer portion was $102.96 million. 50% of that was used to reduce regulatory assets, and the remaining was refunded to customers. And Georgia Power was allowed to retain $51.48 million. What you're going to see on the next slide, when Carrie, you can go ahead and turn it over to the next slide. But basically, as part of the 2019 rate case, there was some adjustments to the multi-year rate plan where part of the customer's portion would be used to pay down regulatory assets instead of refunded to the customers. But this is the results of the last rate case Georgia Power had. Pretty much everything but the top line was in a settlement offer that staff did not sign on to. This was probably the first time in the last 10 years that staff in the company did not reach a settlement. But Georgia Power reached a settlement with Kroger, some of the commercial groups, but staff was not a party to that stipulation. But the commission set the rates at 10.5%, and the capital structure is 56.44% long-term debt. The earnings band It's 9.5 to 12, so it's not symmetrical. That was something that staff had advocated for. The company will not file a rate case unless their earnings are at the lower end of the band. And the settlement has for the excess earnings for 2018 and 19. Half of the customer's portion will be used to pay down regulatory assets, and it specifically states what it's paying down. 2018 was storm damage, and 2019 was early retirement of a regulatory asset, and it was basically the company had done an investigation for a nuclear site for that. And so the excess earnings and future cases, you see the change in the structure. 40% is going to be refunded to customers, 40% is going to be paid off regulatory asset accounts, and 20% is going to be retained by the company. The ASR requirement is still the same. However, it's got commission review and adjustments have to be completed by July 31st of the same year. So that is something, normally staff gets that changed to we have at least a year to do the review. So I'm not really sure how that's going to work out. And then also too, the company has an interim cost recovery mechanism, which has been approved for many years. And basically, if through their budgets and forecasts, if the company does not think they're going to meet their ROE, they can come in and ask for a tariff to be approved and to get them to their authorized return on equity. That has not been used since 2009. During the recession, the company did get a recovery mechanism approved, but it has not been used since then. Next slide. Okay, the only thing I really want to cover on this slide is part of the stipulation. It kind of sets out when the company's going to file their next rate case, their test period. But what I want to highlight is the sentence in bold, and David kind of covered this. The company has taken the position that they have to agree to this alternate rate plan. So it's in the order, it's in the stipulation that they can come in the rate case, they can propose to continue, modify, or discontinue this rate plan. And so it is something that staff, the commission, and the utility support because of the reasons David mentioned. It keeps the company, not coming to the commission every year for a rate case, or the commission having to issue a real NISA, and basically you can only get prospective earnings over earnings, not really retrospect. So this is something that has been supported by the Georgia Commission for, as you can see, for a very long time. So Carrie, that is all that I have.
Thanks. Thank you, Jamie. Do we have Amy ready to go for? Great.
I'm here.
Where's yours?
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I apologize. I do not have as interesting a background as either of my two co-presenters, but my name is Amy Andrews. I'm the Policy Director for the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. And just by way of background, the Washington Commission does not have the extensive experience that Georgia has had, but we do have a couple of examples that I will kind of go over. And we also do not believe that our regulatory authority really allows us to force companies into multi-year rate plans. So it really is being considered on a case-by-case basis as they're brought forward by the companies. Okay, next slide. So my first example is, what I consider a simple example. It was a 2-year rate plan that provided some components that were becoming a little novel for our commission in that it approved end-of-period rate base. There was a rate design collaborative that was permitted if the parties came to an agreement before year 2 rate effective period. They did not utilize that option. The company prior had a parity ratio between some of its classes that was a little out of whack, and it had come more into alignment. So we allowed the second year to go in with an equal spread. It also provided some additional low-income bill funding assistance, and I believe it was twice the residential rate impact. Next slide. So there were no escalation factors or efficiency requirements required. It was a very short multi-year rate plan, and in just 2 years, And the primary cost drivers were very discrete projects, specifically around some coal plant investments. So we just required an attestation and supporting documents for those actual expenditures to be identified prior to second year rates, with a short turnaround for staff to be able to check that compliance filing. Next slide. So example 2 was more of a novel approach for our commission. First, it was filed as part of an expedited rate filing. This was a different type of process that the commission was considering. Utilities were interested in a shorter than 11-month procedural schedule. They were hoping for something around a 4 to 6 month schedule. However, the few cases that we tried for IRFs, I think the shortest amount of time we ever achieved was 9 months. So we really haven't seen much of an effort to continue the IRF proceedings. But we have been looking for multi-year rate plans as a way to break that pattern of continuous rate cases. And I appreciated David's comment about the gerbil cage, because in the last 12 months, we have processed, or are in the process of 5 rate cases. So every single one of our energy utilities has been in this last calendar year. But this particular plan began as a 3-year plan, and it worked in conjunction with the implementation of a full decoupling mechanism for this utility. So it was a little bit novel in that we were both implementing a rate plan and decoupling at the same time, and trying to allow for additional time to make sure that these mechanisms were working as intended. In fact, it worked so well that the utility came in toward the end of the first 3-year cycle and said, we'd like to exercise an option that was provided by the commission in its order to extend that rate plan another year. There was some incentive for the utility to become more efficient and cut some costs. There were also consumer protections involved as far as an earnings sharing mechanism, and again, some additional low income funding. This was part of a partial settlement, so we didn't have to decide each piece on our own. The annual rate increases were also capped over that 3-year period, each period for 3% for electric and 2.2% for gas. Go ahead, next slide, please. So the use of the escalation factor is very similar to a Kfactor in that it fixed the annual increases in delivery costs. These were set below the historical levels. So this case looked at a 5-year historical period, and then used a projected CPI, and then included a 0.5% of a productivity factor. So that's why you see at the bottom of the slide the historical data with that projected CPI for expenditures was around 4% and 3.8% for electric and gas respectively, but those were obviously reduced to the 3 and 2.2 that was mentioned. And we did use a weighted average for the expense-related components of the non-production rate base, depreciation expense, and other O&M. Next slide. So some of the other components to this IRF proceeding was that there were no adjustments that were going to be made to the capital structure or ROE during the plan. The earnings mechanism was above 25 basis points above the ROR, required a split with 50-50 with customers, and the low income consideration was the proportional increase to the funding for each year of that rate plan. Next slide. So something that we're challenged with is we definitely are wanting to see more rate plans. We are hearing from our utilities that may be a challenge with the current pandemic. We're also looking to sync up multi-year rate plans with our very large and transformative energy policy or bill that was put into effect at the end of the 2018 session, which was the Clean Energy Transformation Act. That requires a 4-year clean investment plan to be filed with the companies, where those investments would come into rates. So it makes sense that we would have some kind of multi-year rate plan to then flow those through into rates. And we also received a clarification regarding our authority for multi-year rate plans. We had a challenge on the attrition adjustment in a case, and so the legislature provided clarification, and we are now permitted to include capital investments up to 48 months after the rate effective period. So with that, I think that was brief, but hopefully gets us closer back onto time. Thank you.